Hi, everybody. This week we'll conclude our discussion of the Reformation, including some attention to developments in the immediate post Reformation period. This will lead us up to the modern world in the events of the American and French revolutions, from which we'll begin next time. But first, the conclusion of our discussion of the Reformation. We have here an image that I've chosen for the first slide of one of the many monasteries that was dissolved in England following the break of King Henry VIII with the Catholic Church. And I say dissolved, even though that is, in a way, a kind of euphemism. They were destroyed, and the wealth of them was taken. We'll see when we discuss those events that Henry VIII had some reason for doing that, but it has also been a source of some nostalgia in England. Later Romantic writers would speak of the ruined choirs of these monasteries which dot the English landscape, and they stand as a reminder of the events that we will discuss this week. Last time, we traced the origins and the main figures associated with the Reformation in terms of thought leaders. We looked at the causes of the Reformation, the origins of the term Protestant, that there were a certain number of princes who were protesting certain restrictions placed on religious liberty for various reasons we discussed. We looked at some of the main themes in Reformation theology. These include sola scriptura, the claim that the Bible alone should be the source of a Christian's faith and not traditions or reason applied in addition to what is in the biblical text. We looked at the idea of justification by faith, that a person is justified, that is saved by his or her faith in Jesus Christ and not by any works that he or she might do or have done during their lifetime. And finally, this notion of the priesthood of all believers, an elimination of the mediatory role, the role of mediation that in the Catholic and Orthodox traditions has always been understood to pertain to the figure of the priest, that the priest is a bridge, in a way, a pontiff in the language associated with the person of the Pope in the Catholic Church, between this world and God. This role of priesthood is attributed to every single Christian in the Reformation and not simply to a kind of hierarchy of leaders, ordained leaders. We looked at the work of Luther and Zwingli and Calvin, the three main figures of the Reformation. In the case of Luther, we saw he really symbolically launched the Reformation with his publication of the 95 Theses, in which he took aim at certain both theological beliefs and practices in the Catholic Church of his time. He also translated the Bible into German, joining the ranks of many who had translated the Bible into the vernacular. Vernacular means the everyday language of the people. And for this, he was roundly criticized, but by some, but also celebrated by many. And of course, translations of the Bible today are an important part of Western cultures. We also saw the work of Ulrich Zwingli in Zurich, in Switzerland. His focus on the study of Scripture, the careful, very personal kind of devotional study of Scripture. His rejection of the supernatural, of supernatural grace and all of the systems associated with that in Catholic faith, and also his insistence that the Eucharist, the communion, bread and wine, right, was just a symbolic remembrance of a past event of Jesus's leadership, Jesus at the Last Supper, right, and not an event with the kind of supernatural significance it would later acquire in other traditions. Finally, John Calvin, unlike Luther and Zwingli, who were pretty much exact contemporaries, Calvin was a bit younger, and his contribution was not so much to frame the thinking that would characterize the Protestant Reformation, but to organize it and to express it in his work, the Institutes. He had a leadership role in Geneva, which we learned about, and he also upheld that and based his practice on a conviction that a system of theology could be derived from the Bible alone. You don't need, Thomas Aquinas or Augustine or other, fathers of the church. All you need is Scripture. We pick up our story in the years immediately following John Calvin's work and kind of overlapping with all three of those in a certain degree. The Reformation, we're reminded this week, was not simply a single event associated even with the three streams represented by Luther and Zwingli and Calvin. It was often a local affair. Individual princes, individual kings and monarchs in various places would separate from Catholic faith, often not so much for theological reasons, even as for political reasons. But there were also many different points of view, many different manners of criticizing Catholic faith, represented by different people. In Germany and Switzerland, we see the emergence of the Anabaptist movement. Anabaptist means to be rebaptized. Members of the Anabaptist movement felt that Luther and Zwingli had not gone far enough, that they had remained still in the thrall of Catholic thinking. A more radical approach was needed, and hence the title on the slide here, the Radical Reformation. We read in McGrath, a number of common elements can be discerned within the various strands of the Anabaptist movement: a general distrust of external authority, the rejection of infant baptism in favor of the baptism of adult believers, the common ownership of property, and an emphasis upon pacifism and non-resistance. We can note a couple of these. We saw something about the rejection of external authority last week. That continues here. But the rejection of infant baptism, if you baptize a baby, the baby doesn't know what's going on. It's a baby, right? If you baptize an adult, that person is able to consciously accept what is being said at that baptism and undertake the commitments associated with it. So for the Anabaptists, people needed to be re-baptized. Anabaptist, right? The baptism of a person when they're a month old does not indicate their personal conviction or commitment to the Christian faith, and they felt that this was of overriding importance. The Anabaptist movement has been called the left wing of the Reformation, as compared to what is called by McGrath the magisterial Reformation of Luther and Zwingli. Magisterial here comes from the Latin word magister, which means a teacher. The Catholic Church has what is known as the magisterium. This refers to the authority of the Catholic Church, or its own understanding of its authority to teach. So whereas Luther and Zwingli were kind of reworking theology on this fairly high level, the Anabaptist movement sought for a more radical, on-the-ground, practical implementation of a new vision of Christianity. We've already mentioned the opposition to the baptism of infants, but the most radical claim is this, that in the Catholic Church, the Christian Church, the Church of Jesus Christ, had ceased to exist. There was no more Christian church, right? That the Catholic Church was a kind of degraded, right, degenerate, decadent, the three Ds, version of the Christian church. And so what was needed was not a reform of the Catholic Church, but a restoration of Christian faith. That Christian faith had been lost over the centuries, and only through rebaptism and a personal recommitment to the ideals of Jesus Christ could one be saved. Could the Christian church actually begin again to exist? You see this belief still very commonly held among many Protestant Christians, even in the United States, who might question whether Catholics are even Christian, right? So you often hear a distinction between Catholics and Christians, right? That is rooted in this Anabaptist conviction that, in fact, Catholics are not Christians, right? Or they're not Christians because they're Catholics, right? They might be Christian on their own, but just the fact that they're baptized as an infant in the Catholic Church does not make them, in the meaningful respect, Christian. In 1534, in the city of Münster in Germany, the Anabaptists actually took over the city by force and demanded that the population be rebaptized or be put to death. They also redistributed property equally among members of the population. So we see here a really, what we would say in later language, puritanical, a really, radical expression of Christian faith. And we'll say more about the Puritans in a moment. Meanwhile, in England, we see the beginnings of the English Reformation. Luther's ideas were widely discussed in England. England was still Catholic at this time. Many in England were critical of the low quality of the clergy. They thought the church was engaging in some practices that were questionable. We saw those themes already at the beginning of our lecture last time, talking about the origins of the Reformation generally. The catalyzing event here, though, involved Henry VIII. Henry VIII was married to Catherine of Aragon, but Catherine did not produce for him a male heir. Now, that's a problem if you're the king, right? Because you do not then have a clear line of succession from yourself to the next person. That's bad for the country, right? It could be a war. It's probably going to be a war. So Henry wants to have a good transition of power, and he basically writes to the Pope and says, want to divorce Catherine because, no male heir. And the Pope says no, right? Now, of course, the reasons for this are complex and very interesting, and we won't go into all of them here, but Pope says no. So Henry VIII makes tough call and says, okay, well, we're done with the Catholic Church. We're done with the Pope, right? In 1529, he declares that priests in England are in effect all traitors. They have allegiance to the Pope and not allegiance to him. He names Thomas Cranmer to be the Archbishop of Canterbury. That is without the approval of the Pope, and so he takes over the running of the church in England, which comes to be called the Church of England. And in a series of acts, he finalizes this split with the Catholic Church. He dissolves the monasteries, which we've already referred to on our title slide, and he does so in order to pay for defense against attack by Catholic powers, including Spain, from which Catherine of Aragon was from Spain, and France at that time. The images of Thomas Cranmer. Henry himself was, however, pretty friendly to Catholic thinking. He didn't have a problem with Catholic theology, right? It's not that he, like Luther or Zwingli or Calvin, thought that the church was unbearably corrupt and so forth. He just didn't accept the authority of the Pope to tell him what he can and cannot do with respect to the practice of the church within his own territory. So he didn't change a lot about the practice of Christianity in the Church of England. He just changed who is in charge, right? Now, after his death, this develops. People in England become interested in a much more radical version of the Reformation, like the approach taken by Zwingli, a more radical approach. The Eucharist, the bread and the wine, is not a sacrament. It's just I shouldn't say just. I mean, it's an act of remembrance of a past event. And radical theologians from Switzerland and elsewhere in Europe, Netherlands especially, move to England, and where they find protection and an audience for their ideas. In that climate, briefly, there was a restoration of Catholicism in England under Mary Tudor, known as Bloody Mary, because of the numbers of people who died during her reign for reasons of their religious faith. And Mary Tudor most famously burned Thomas Cranmer at the stake. She dies, however, in 1558, and her successor, Elizabeth, she's a pragmatic person, right? So she wants to find a compromise between Catholic faith and this more radical, kind of Zwingli-inspired Reformation faith. And she does so by naming herself the Supreme Governor of the Church of England, a title to which the monarch of England retains, a title which the monarch of England retains to this day, and trying to Elizabeth tried to develop that compromise position. Meanwhile, again, in Italy and elsewhere in the Catholic world, the Catholic Church itself is undergoing a Reformation. So you have the Radical Reformation, especially in the city of Munster with the Anabaptists. You have the English Reformation, and now here you have the Catholic Reformation. So this is sometimes called the Counter Reformation to distinguish it from the Protestant Reformation. But all of these different groups are reforming themselves at this time. Um, in the 1520s, finally, this is underway. It had been delayed by, I say here, political tensions and suspicions about conciliarism. Conciliarism refers to a confidence or refers to a belief that councils should have a measure of authority within the Catholic Church. Right? So the Second Vatican Council, which we'll talk about in a couple of weeks, is an example of a council. And some people really believed that would be an important part of church governance, or should be, and others did not. Um, anyway, those delays are overcome finally in the Council of Trent, held between 1545 and 63, which, as McGrath puts it, gave a new sense of theological direction and intellectual security to the church. This was a major event in the Catholic Church. It is the response of the Catholic Church to not just to Luther, Zwingli, and Calvin individually, but to the fact that the Catholic Church had crumbled all across Europe. So, right, what are the authorities within that church now going to say as the whole kind of, well, I won't say house of cards, as the whole structure comes tumbling down? The Council of Trent instituted changes in rules for bishops and for priests, addressing the issues with clergy, the mistrust of clergy that we've talked about a few times. It promulgated new catechisms, including a universal catechism. The Greek word katechein means to echo or to resound. So, like if you're in a cave and you clap your hands, there will be an echo. So, the word catechism means an echoing of the faith. And the idea is that the catechism expresses the same faith as was held by the early church in the person of Jesus Christ, but expresses it in a way that is closer to our experience today. This universal catechism, put out by the Council of Trent, was the last universal catechism until 1994. It's a very long time. It's not frequent that the church has issued these catechisms, but we'll touch on that later catechism in the last week of our course. Also at this time, outside of the structure of the church, the hierarchy, the bishops and priests and cardinals, there were new spiritual writers and mystical traditions developing. Mysticism here refers to, as we've seen in the medieval week of our course, a conviction that one has or has had a direct experience of God and an effort to give expression to that experience. Individuals associated with that include Teresa of Avila and John of the Cross in Spain, also Ignatius of Loyola, also in Spain. These three authors, we have some selections from their works in our primary source readings for this week. The Council of Trent addressed 5 key areas of Protestant criticism. According to McGrath, the list is helpful. 1, the Vulgate Latin version of the Bible is not accurate. So they try to improve the accuracy of the Bible. The claim that people should interpret the Bible on their own. They respond to this, and there are statements concerning the proper interpretation of Scripture and how that should be undertaken. The Protestant rejection of any source of revelation outside the Bible. Here we have the Council of Trent articulating in a very explicit way, okay, if we're not sola scriptura, right, if we do accept tradition as an equal source of faith alongside Scripture, what exactly does that mean? How does that play out? We get an account of that. They address the doctrine of justification by faith alone, and they work out the system of sacraments. In the Catholic Church currently, there are 7 sacraments that are recognized, and this is in response to the Protestant assertion that, properly speaking, there are only 2. So this is all work at the Council of Trent to share this new, kind of more systematized version of the Catholic faith. The Council of Trent established what is known as the Confraternity of Christian Doctrine, or the CCD. And so in parishes, if you have been to a Catholic church, you might have attended CCD. It's known as Sunday school in Protestant communities, and it's known as CCD in Catholic ones. And this is a direct legacy of the Council of Trent, and a body that continues to exist today. Our last bit here on the first section of the reading concerns women and the Reformation. McGrath does a good job noting many times in his text the very important role of women, even though it was not always recognized in kind of official histories in past years to the extent it should be. Within Catholic circles, women secured power in religious orders and in royal families. Women's religious orders were very powerful and influential at this time, and a woman of ambition might choose to join a convent or a women's religious order as a way to be active in the world and to make positive change. Um, Also, at this time, you see a new emphasis on so-called Marian devotions. Marian here refers to Mary, the mother of Jesus, and this includes the Rosary, which had been introduced by the Dominicans, the order that founded our college, Albertus Magnus College, but became more popular in the period after the Council of Trent. Within Protestant churches, there weren't really religious orders in the same way, and women were accorded a more limited role, often kind of within the household or within the day-to-day operations of the church, even though men retained authority according to the social conventions of that time. But men and women both were held to be radically equal within marriage. Women were given rule over household affairs. So there was certainly not a case where there was no authority given to women, but it was circumscribed in pretty specific ways. And we see also at this time, and we'll talk more about this next week, the persecution of so-called witches, for example, at the Salem witch trials. So the role of women within Christianity, both Catholic and Protestant, was pretty variable at this time. Let's just look at the next section of McGrath's discussion of this later period in the Reformation. So we've seen in the Radical Reformation, in the English Reformation, and in the Catholic Counter-Reformation, a lot of changes in authority. Who is in charge, right? Is it all the people or the elders of a community? Is it the king, right, as in England? Or is it, well, the Pope is in the Catholic Church, but how is authority structured? This discussion of authority led to the establishment of many state churches. And you see this within Europe, especially to this day. Within a certain territory, even though there was no authority coming from the Vatican any longer in Protestant countries, there was an effort on the part of those governments to make uniform Christian belief and practice within their territory. Each of these regions or states was a kind of mini Christendom, McGrath puts it, memorably, governed by its own understanding of what Christianity actually was. So this was a local way of overcoming the kind of fragmentation of authority. Let's see, the difference formerly considered small come to be important and lead to new splits in the church. So you see a great fracturing. So you have the official state church, but then you might have people dissenting from that and forming other smaller Christian churches. And there's emergence of many new Christian churches around differences in theology and practice. The main example of this was the split between Lutherans and Calvinists. So Calvinists formed the various churches known as the Reformed or Congregational churches, whereas Lutherans continued in the tradition of Lutheranism. And you see also here concerning authority, the practice of what's called proof texting. So you might often hear this if you've been involved in any Christian community. Someone would say, well, in Romans 1, Romans chapter 1, verse 15 or something like this, when you cite chapter and verse, right, and you say, this is my authority, you're not saying the Pope is my authority or the king is my authority or this priest is my authority. You're saying, here's the authority, and let me give you the chapter and verse, right? That's going to be the foundation of my claim. An expression of this was the movement known as Puritanism. We're back in England now. Puritans in England refers to a group of people who rejected the so-called Elizabethan settlement. Look back, remember Queen Elizabeth says, I'm going to kind of cut a deal between the Catholics and the Protestants in my territory, right? It's It's going to be C of E, it's going to be Church of England, but we're going to have elements of both Catholic and Protestant practice to kind of hold the community together. Puritans are people who rejected those Catholic style practices and eventually would leave England to go to the Netherlands first and then to North America, where they became the Pilgrims. So you think of the first Thanksgiving, right? Those people were Puritans from England who rejected Catholic style practices in the Church of England and were seeking a place where they could practice their religion freely. These pilgrims were the most radical and kind of separatist. They were close to Anabaptist beliefs in their belief that the Christian church had ceased to exist. They need actually to refound Christianity through biblically based personal faith. And they rejected the authorities of bishops and adopted, as McGrath puts it here, a congregationalist polity. So they didn't trust even the state because they didn't trust Elizabeth, right, who was trying to kind of split the difference there. They rejected the authority of the Pope, they rejected the authority of the monarch, and they said each community should make a decision for itself as to what its practice of the Christian faith is going to look like. A big example of this is Roger Williams, who's talked about in the reading. He's a founder of the city of Providence in Rhode Island. And he approached this in a way that combined it with religious toleration. So he was a person who accepted the practice of many faiths within a civil society and yet had very strong Christian convictions of his own. I've passed over here the translation of the Bible, the King James Bible. We'll come back to that on a separate slide. And here it is. Okay, here's a separate slide. So within England, around the time the Puritans were leaving, first to the Netherlands and then to North America, King James in England wanted to kind of entrench that Elizabethan settlement, right? To entrench that compromise, and to do so by producing a new translation of the Bible, of the whole Bible. And in that translation, to number one, be very literal, to stay close to the original Hebrew and Greek texts, but also where interpretation was called for, to do it in a way that was carefully chosen and to avoid supporting Puritan or Calvinist readings, right? Because he, as the King of England, is threatened by this group that says we don't accept the king's authority to interpret the Bible. Well, he says, okay, I'm going to produce a Bible that does, allow for that and does not give space for the Puritan interpretations that reject the king's authority. So he gathers together this company of translators in different places, 50 translators, and they begin this translation of what is called the King James Bible. So this is still widely used today and certainly the best known English translation of the Bible. The translation, as I've said, is literal. It offers an English word for every word of the Greek or the Hebrew, even when it sounds strange. So, in a way, the King James Bible gave shape to the English language today, insofar as it became such an influential work. It introduced a lot of new phrases. I have a few of them on the slide here. To fall flat on your face, to pour out your heart, the powers that be. These phrases are just kind of in the language now, but they were considered very odd at the time. They're literal translations from the Hebrew or the Greek. Also, the second to last note here, different typefaces were used for the actual text itself and scholarly additions. There was a great concern that any additions to the text should be clearly indicated as such, right? The text should be pure, as close to the original as possible, and reliable. This was supposed to be the definitive English translation, right? Not just the work of one guy or a small group, but an authorized version. That's what it's called, in fact, the authorized version, or the King James Bible. Around the same time, we see a lot of developments in other areas as the new diversity of Christian churches interacts with the culture. And we're going to focus here especially on on the arts and sciences. In the medieval church, we have on the slide here, the drama of the liturgy was supplemented by images. The Catholic Reformation sees the renaissance of liturgical art and music, or sees a renaissance. So within the Catholic Reformation, or the Counter-Reformation in the Catholic Church, there was this connection with what is known as the Baroque period in art and music. This kind of, we would say perhaps today, a very beautiful expression through the music of people such as Johann Sebastian Bach, who was Lutheran but wrote for both Lutheran and Catholic patrons. Protestant styles of art at the time go less in that kind of, we'll call it Baroque, ornate, decorative kind of direction, and they're more spare. Images are not used, but hymns become very important. And so the tradition of developing hymns in the vernacular language, in local languages, becomes central to Protestant worship. And still today, I mean, we see this very much, right? The gospel music and hymns are very important in the lives of many Christian believers, both Catholic and Protestant, perhaps especially Protestant. We've mentioned that we'll talk about both the arts and the sciences. In the case of the sciences, these events are overlapping to some degree with the period known as the Scientific Revolution in the late 17th century. So that's the late 1600s. This challenges longstanding Christian beliefs. Now, you could say, well, Galileo is the standout example here, right? The Catholic Church, Galileo, I have the last point on the slide here, is a symbol of these debates, and the Catholic Church puts him under house arrest and rejects his claim that the earth goes around the sun, and so forth. The one reason why the Catholic Church was so insistent on that and acted so poorly, as we would say today, rightly, and as the Catholic Church itself has admitted in later years, is because of the pressure that Catholic leaders were under, seeing as this was just following the time of the Protestant Reformation. To have the authority of the church questioned not only in matters theological, but also to have church traditional interpretations of the Bible questioned by scientists was seen as too much, and it led to the specific manner of the Catholic response. There's a shift here, of course, from the geocentric to the heliocentric view involving Copernicus and Galileo, and this was seen to conflict with a literal reading of the Bible. But we see here not only, here's the upshot, guys. It's not only that religious people are narrow-minded and a bit stupid and refuse to accept, the findings of natural science. It's that we're talking about different layers of authority here, and many different interests that people have, and also legitimate questions about what interpretation should mean in the case of the Bible or in the case of scientific findings. I mean, during Galileo's lifetime, there was not robust evidence for the view that he upheld, although in the end, of course, it proved to be absolutely right, and his detractors proved to be absolutely wrong. But when we look at these debates, I think it's important not to define too starkly the conflict between science and religion. I mean, there have been numerous conflicts of that kind, and they have driven conversations in both of those spaces. But it's not so simple as sometimes it is made out to be. We have a phrase here that represents some of this from Johannes Kepler, an important mathematician and astronomer of the time. Geometry, he is quoted as saying, is one and eternal, shining in the mind of God. That share in it accorded to humans of geometry is one of the reasons that humanity is the image of God. So what are we saying here? It's not science versus religion, right? Math versus religion. These scientists regarded their scientific endeavors as explorations of what is called the book of nature. So you have the book of Scripture, it's the Bible, right? That's one way in which God has revealed God's self, according to Christian belief. You also have the book of nature. That is God's creation. It is another way in which God has revealed God's self. Right? And so in the early years of the scientific revolution, and right up through the 19th century and even after, there was a conviction on the part of many scientists, natural philosophers, that what they were doing was not impious. They were not disproving the existence of God. They were undermining unjust claims to authority on behalf of Christian leaders or priests and theologians, and they were thus illuminating more clearly the nature of God and the way in which God was involved in the world and the relationship between God and human beings. So again, we see some complexity here that McGrath helps us to understand as well in his text. A last slide here, and we end with a rather violent image, I'm afraid, of the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre in France. Our last slide concerns the wars of religion. So as the scientific revolution was getting underway, these wars tore across France and England and Germany and elsewhere in Europe. A defining event in that, and a paradigmatic, symbolic event of these wars of religion, was the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, where up to 10,000 French Protestants, known as Huguenots, were killed. Many would emigrate from France to the New World, populating the province of Quebec in Canada, as well as other parts of the Maritimes. The English Civil War was connected with this as well, which was largely a conflict between Puritans and Anglicans. And that's the same conflict that Elizabeth tried to settle, the same conflict that James in the King James Bible tried to adjudicate, right, between more radical Protestant style, let's say, Christians represented by the Puritans, following the ideas of Calvin and Anabaptists, whereas the Anglicans were more Catholic in their style and theology and followed more Luther. The 30 Years' War, as described by McGrath between 1618 and 48, this involved conflicts between Lutherans and Reformed and Catholic groups, all the groups we've seen, and you can feel this kind of building to a head, the tension, the battle, right? And then it resolves, and it resolves in the Treaty of Westphalia, known as the Peace of Westphalia. This led to a new demand for tolerance and gave expression to a rejection of religious disputes as such. People were tired of it. People were tired of all the fighting, more than a century of battles over religion. And we see that writers like John Locke, the last point here on our slide, call, in the wake of this Peace of Westphalia and the end of the wars of religion, for a more secular and tolerant society. The ideas of John Locke led directly into the American Revolution, which itself inspired the French Revolution and opened the way to what we call, in the fullest sense, the modern world. So we've come to the end in 1648 here of these wars of religion and of the Reformation period for the purposes of our class. All right, friends, I hope you have learned a bit and enjoyed. I look forward next time to continuing our discussion, and I look forward to our discussion in class as well.